It has long been accepted in paranormal circles the connection between water and spiritual entities. Some would argue that water conducts the elemental energy like electricity, and particularly moving water, such as streams, rivers and the sea. Water is also the source of life, and it is that connection between life and death which binds non-corporeal beings to it. Add, if you will, a crossing point across moving water to an abandoned place which once thrived with human activity and tragedy, and then you have all that binds the dead to the world of the living. For one such place in the ancient lands of England, there lies tucked away from human activity a quiet still water, hidden in part by fallen and broken trees, and made more inaccessible by nettles and bracken, which smother the sinuous lines of the former ornamental lake, designed and overseen by the landscape architect Humphrey Repton in the year 1811. The ornamental lake was financed by a wealthy Essex family, who built a large country house there 10 or so years earlier. Repton was a much sought-after landscape gardener in affluent Regency society, and as the nouveau riche were in social competition with the old landed gentry, Repton's mark on the landscape would surely make them the envy of their peers in pre-Victorian England. But in order to achieve this social goal, it was necessary for an army of poorly paid labourers to dig out the lake by hand, and to toil the gardens to Repton's exact requirements. And in the process, many men, mostly from Ireland, came and died completing this monstrous task, and lamentably left their souls trapped by water to roam this now abandoned landscape. In fact, whenever anyone attends this forlorn and forsaken location, that heavy feeling of death and abandonment permeates the atmosphere like a dark shroud enveloping the twisted and broken trees lying in deep water and encapsulating the heavy undergrowth. And one cannot fail to notice that someone, somewhere, is watching with suspicious eyes. This indeed is the Lake of the Dead, and yet at one time it was a main social focus for the surrounding district, with many boating and ice skating events being held there. But all that is a distant memory, as with the former mansion, which disappeared forever under demolition dust in the 1920s. But the story of this estate is much more interesting than that, and with it, a fair measure of tragedy was suffered by the family themselves, as I will explain later. The original late Georgian family home of Repton's time was demolished in the 1860s, to be replaced with a rather ornate French-influenced country house, which made the surrounding ornate gardens and lake seem much more pivotally continental in character. A new sumptuous ironwork bridge was fashioned across a choke point on the lake, and that took visitors on a grand tour of the estate from its entrance in Park Lane. The bridge, like the architectural quality of the house, was quite revolutionary, and was of a single-span, bar-stayed cantilever design. In fact, so unique that even today the bridge has a protection order and is considered of national interest, despite much of the wrought iron panelling and adornments being missing. But here the bridge, being a main crossing point over the water, has focused the attention of those in spirit themselves, with much EVP being captured here. Quite some years ago, the lake was run and maintained by a fishing club whose members reported odd and strange events of an elemental kind occurring around its waters. And here is a verbatim account of 3 such fishermen who decided to visit the lake at night, and with it a deeply disturbing event was experienced. All that remained were the foundations and a large ornate iron bridge that crosses one end of the lake to the driveway, and the road situated about half a mile away. The lake was, and still is, typical of many estate lakes: shallow, big lily beds, boggy around the margins, and surrounded by big old gnarled trees. Even during the day, it possessed an atmosphere that could only be described as heavy. Often when fishing there, a strange sensation would fall upon the place, sending shivers down the spine and making you want to keep looking behind you. Even the birds and the waterfowl would suddenly go silent, and any breeze rippling the surface would fall still. Rarely did anyone fish there alone. They couldn't explain why, just never did. To fish there was at night never heard of. That is to say, why we decided to do so, we went as a threesome, considering that two of us would not be enough if something happened. Arriving around 8 p.m, it gave us enough time to set up before darkness fell at 9:30. I chose to fish from the centre of the old dam wall. My mate Ted 60 yards to my left, and in the corner was my mate Len around 100 yards to my right on the field bank. It was agreed that we would fish until around 1 a.m, depending on the results, either to pack it in or continue until breakfast time. As darkness began to fall, a little light but cold breeze sprang up from nowhere, just chilly enough to make you lift the collar of your shirt and shrug your shoulders. Even more strange was that it seemed to come from a dense wooded area, which kissed the edge of the lake and ran back up the hill to where the hall once stood. By 11 p.m. it was pitch black, and glancing to my right I could see by the glow of Len's roll-up cigarette that he was making his way towards me. "Not much happening round there," he said as he arrived at my side. And by now my companion stood beside me, and as we discussed what had happened, we became aware of a great presence descending around us. Hard to describe it, just felt really heavy, dark, and very, very sad. Now the three of us were all seasoned anglers, spending much of our time fishing after dark, often alone, but this was something else. Something we had never experienced before or since, thank God. "I think I'll call it a night," I said. "Feels like a storm coming." The others agreed and said we would stop for a pint on the way home, and then it happened. From out of nowhere, a scream rang out, a scream so loud that you couldn't think straight. We froze to the spot and reached for our torches. They didn't work. 3 torches and not a glimmer between them. That scream turned to a wow, still loud on one long note, drowning our voices as we tried to speak. We knew what each other was saying, and within a minute, all tackle was retrieved, line bitten through, stuff just grabbed as we stumbled our way along the field bank towards the iron bridge, the old driveway and the sanctuary of the car. The wow followed our every footstep, growing neither louder or quieter. Ted was the first to reach the bridge, and as soon as he set foot on it, all fell silent, very silent, painfully silent. I reached for my torch, and yes, it worked, and so did the others. We looked at each other in disbelief, but dared not utter a word. What could be said? And if we spoke, would the screaming start again? No, we just looked, and then we continued on the long walk to the car. How many times I looked over my shoulder, I would be guessing, but it was a lot, and the same went for the other 2. We didn't stop at the pub, and we drove straight home in silence. In fact, it was more than a week before we spoke about it, and then only for a minute. Another night account, believed to be from the same remote location by description, was shared a few years back. Suddenly there was a loud screaming sound coming from behind us. I turned to look at my cousin. By this time his face was pale, and we asked out loud at the same time, "Did you hear that?" "Yes, I did." "What was it?" "I don't know. I've never heard that before." As much as we both tried to ignore it, we kept alert, but then it passed. and after about an hour or so we'd forgotten about the incident. We didn't catch much, so we decided to pack up and call it a night. When we were headed back to our car, we started hearing rustling leaves behind us. We turned around thinking it was an animal, but there was nothing there. So we kept on, and right as we were about to hop into our motor, a woman appeared right in front of us a few feet away. She looked dirty and a little beat up, with some bloodstains on what seemed to be a nightgown of some sort. We shouted, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She continued to stare at us. Then the shrieking scream we had heard before came out of her mouth. My cousin and I were petrified, and we got into the car and drove off. Haven't gone to our spot ever since. We have never told anyone what happened, but I can still hear that scream from time to time. Further mystery is added to the reputation of this site from local newspaper accounts. In 1924, two meteorites or fireballs allegedly collided over the site while two men were night fishing at the lake. The explosion was seen for miles and many fireballs scattered across the lake, with the water and surrounding land visibly shook. The men beneath thought this was the end of the world and expected to die, but as quickly as it happened, it instantaneously stopped, and all that was lit up as day returned to night. On inspection by police and notified military sources, no trace of any damage was found, and no aircraft were reported as missing. Was it a collision of two meteorites, or something off-world? And a greater mystery was that in 1940, a corporal in the Royal Military Police, serving with the Royal Army Service Corps, was posted overnight at a huge bomb crater, now gone, to keep out the public. The crater was in a field next to the old ornamental lake. On the following day, when being relieved by another soldier, there was no trace of him to be found. And in the following months, there was no trace of him turning up either as a deserter. The authorities, stumped for answers, assumed that another bomb had hit the crater and had blown him to pieces. Of course, the chances of this in the same place is mathematically impossible, as the crater seen before had not changed. However, the locals treated it as a gravesite until the crater was filled in some years after World War II. Further light on this mystery was added in 1966, when an author, Leslie German, visited the location to follow up on the story. It was easy to find and is still readily discernible as the place where a bomb has fallen. Corn grows tall and plump each year in the field where the bomb fell. It is splashed with the scarlet of poppies. One large square near the ornamental lake is surrounded with rusted barbed wire on posts, and in summer there is on the wind the scent of thistles in bloom, and the thistles grow in the crater. Did the soldier die there? If so, how was he killed? Why was no trace even found, although the crater was excavated afterwards? The clipping said that he was killed while inspecting a bomb crater. Why then was the crater not larger? Had two bombs fallen on the same spot, one of them as he stood there? I had looked back in the newspapers of the time before going to the village, but they were of no help at all because in 1940 there was strict press censorship. So I asked the villagers. One man whose house is close to the enclosure, it is not recognizably a grave, said that he had vanished into an existing crater and was sucked down into it. Another said that the troops who dug in the crater to find him were gassed by something there. One woman said that she'd lived close by at the same time, but had never heard an explosion at that particular period. I went into the local pub for a sandwich and a glass of beer, and I asked about the incident there. Yes, everybody knew of it, but no one knew the true facts. Both the post and the cross have long since gone, and the barbed wire around the broad crater is rusting away, the post supporting it forming a large fence all the way around. So, what happened to him? Earlier I had mentioned tragedy that had befallen the family themselves, and from newspaper accounts the following verified reports were elicited. In 1842, a son, Henry, late of the estate and living in private care in Brighton, went quite mad following the untimely death of his parents. He was later committed to a lunatic asylum where he ended his days. In 1882, another descendant, Herbert, aged 25, was killed riding in a dog cart being driven by his brother Reginald. They apparently were riding, not unlike the depiction, with two sisters when the cart overturned after running one wheel accidentally up a bank. They were all thrown into the road, with Herbert sadly landing on his head, which led to his death. The sisters, like Reginald, were uninjured, but Reginald followed Herbert to the grave rather unexpectedly a few months later with no known cause of death. Was it grief that took his life or some otherworldly event? We sadly will never know. But at a stroke, all male heirs and the future of the house and the estate was now in doubt. But the weirdest tragedy occurred after a relative decided to dispose of the estate bequeathed to him in the 1920s. While the property was empty and being offered for sale, gardeners were kept on to look after the estate until a buyer could be found. One employee, an Albert Chapman, aged 47, was found dead with his head in the well at the house in July 1923. He had strangely suffered with depression the week before, although his family doctor could not establish any reason why he was so ill, and police were unable to establish any homicide committed against him. Eventually, in April 1925, a local builder bought the estate with the intention of moving his wife and family in there. His wife, however, refused to move from her home, and sadly the house was taken apart by the builder, who sold the brick and stone privately. He later claimed it was the best investment he had ever made, as the profits from the demolition alone was amply more than he had paid for the house and the estate combined. He retained the land for himself and used it for agricultural purposes for a number of years afterwards, but the lake, being a foil to the now-gone house, soon fell into a state of unwanted and unloved neglect. Today, the lake and former gardens is now owned by another farmer, who appears to be attempting to restore the waters, although the former road bridge stands barred from further access to the remains of the house by a secured and locked field gate. In its forlorn state, the site and its ambience is still very prevalent to many walkers who visit there, and all have reported on its natural beauty with an ominous air of depression. Whether those that died will pass on is not known, for only time will tell whether they will finally be rested, but the lake is deeply troubled. I myself have visited the site on many occasions. Everything described by others is perfectly true, from sudden breezes on a still day to the ominous feeling of sadness and the sensing of ever-present souls watching and following my every move. It is indeed a dark and mysterious place.